So we bring in the studio this morning the ambassador of the United States of America to the Republic of Kazakhstan. Greetings, Mr. Daniel Rosenblum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to be with you today.
My pleasure. Just a little announcement also, the English is my third language, or fourth even, so I would have many mistakes, so please forgive me. You and also an audience, my language skills is to be improved.
No worries. Your English is quite good, and your English is better than my Kazakh. That's it.
How's your Kazakh going, by the way?
Slowly. I wish I had more time to study. That's my biggest problem, is the lack of time, because I have so many meetings and trips. But I'm trying to. I just saw my Kazakh teacher this morning.
Oh, I see.
Because we have a tutor who comes in, but it's very slow.
Oh, I see. But you see what? Many ambassadors that I was happened to meet here, they don't even try to learn Kazakh. But as I see the American ambassadors, usually, as the habit, they try to speak Kazakh. They congratulate in Kazakh language in Nowruz or at the Independence Day. So that is one of the obligations for the ambassador, or is your own will to speak the language?
Yeah, it is an obligation in the sense that we're encouraged strongly to learn the language of the country we're posted in, that the national language. But in my case, it's also a personal choice, because I think it's important to be able to at least say some things in the language of the people that you're serving, the country you're serving in. I think it's essential to show respect. You're showing respect for their national traditions. And so even though I'm at an age now where learning new languages is not easy, my brain doesn't work the way it did when I was 20 years old, I still think it's important to at least try. And so as you mentioned, I've been recording messages, videos, for holidays. For Nowruz, I think I made a video, and several other occasions. I made a video when I first arrived in the country in Kazakh. And I have to be honest, when I make those videos, I have to work hard. I have to practice, and I repeat over and over so that I can try to speak in a way that sounds real, that sounds like I know the language. But unfortunately, when it comes to normal conversation, day-to-day conversation, I struggle still. But still, I think people appreciate that I make the effort to do those videos and to at least say a few words in Kazakh.
I see.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll have this slight conversation in Kazakh. I mean, just the greetings, yeah? Сәлеметсіз бе, Елша Мырза?
Сәлеметсіз бе?
Қалайсыз?
Жақсы, рахмет. Өте жақсы.
Мен де өте жақсымын. Рахмет сізге келгеніңізге. So the test is is approved. It's really interesting how they start the conversation in USA. So as I know, they're really good Americans. They're really good in the small talk. Not just like us. It's really hard to make a small talk in Kazakh sometimes. But if you were the host, how would you start the podcast? I mean, in American way. With the weather or with what?
You mean if I was the host?
Yeah.
How would I start? So it's interesting because I listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and there are very different styles I've noticed. What I like is when the host starts with maybe some more personal question that brings out something about the person's personality, and maybe makes them more relaxed, because talking about yourself is almost the easiest thing that you can do. So for the guest, it helps. But I've heard other podcasts where the host will go directly to some very substantive question, something very detailed, and it's just a different style. But I actually listened to one podcast by a guy named Steve Levitt. I don't know if you've heard of Steve Levitt. He wrote a book 20 years ago called Freakonomics.
Oh, yeah.
You know that book,
Definitely.
Freakonomics? Yeah. And he has, I think his style is just about perfect from my standpoint, because he mixes the more personal questions with the questions about the theme of that person's expertise or some policy or something. He has a podcast that's called People I Mostly Admire.
Oh.
So it's people that I admire, but mostly, not everything. I mostly admire them. And it's actually, I guess I'm not supposed to be doing endorsements for other podcasts here because
No,
we're
it's
about
okay.
your podcast, but I like his way of interviewing.
No, I see.
Yeah.
So maybe some personal questions also can be. So you came in November, yeah?
Yes.
If you was the ambassador to the Republic of Uzbekistan before,
That's right.
yeah. As the American, what differences can you see between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan? I mean, cultural differences, the people, the way the work is going on. Did you notice something?
So, what's interesting is I noticed a lot of similarities more than differences, but
That's for sure.
But there are differences too. First of all, I was not unfamiliar with Kazakhstan before. Even though I only moved here in November, I had visited many times. I have visited many times over the years, including as far back as the early 1990s. I was in Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
When I worked in previous jobs before being ambassador. So I already had some familiarity with it. I think that there's no doubt that there's a lot of similarity because of the historical legacy.
Yeah.
Both are Turkic peoples, right? And so there's language similarities and cultural similarities. Both had a similar history of being conquered by other nations and empires over time, and then both have the common tradition of Islam, right? Of the Islamic tradition and culture. Obviously, you notice some differences because of the nomadic tradition being so strong here and not so much in Uzbekistan. Although even in Uzbekistan, there are nomadic people, and I was in Karakalpakstan a number of times, and so I see the similarities there. So I see it as more as like a spectrum of Central Asia, where, just as in the color spectrum, the colors blend one into the other, and you go from, you start with purples and the blues, and you end up with the yellows.
Yeah.
But in between, the colors look kind of similar as you go along the spectrum, and that's the way I see Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan.
Yeah, that's the point. Yeah, we are the one region, and we have a lot of similarities, and a lot of things we have to do together.
Yes.
That's what now we can see. All the states or the presidents of the states come to China, for example, Russia, to deal with the third party. Let's say so. Yeah. Only together, because together they can stand some power.
Yeah.
And when it comes to USA, when you say that you're from Central Asia, usually the average American don't understand what is the Central Asia. You're an Asians. We know the West Asia, we know East Asia, we know Asia Pacific, we know South, but Central Asia, who are you? You're Middle East, or you what? Or you post-Soviet? It's really a problem.
Yeah. I'm sure you experienced this when you visited the United States, and I experience it all the time. Most Americans don't know anything about Central Asia. That's something I try to change myself by going out and speaking to people. Sometimes I go to universities and talk to students in the United States, and try to make them understand what Central Asia is, why it's important to the United States. But you're right. It's not. There's a lot of misunderstanding or ignorance, and too much of people's understanding is based on the location alone. So in other words, the first thing you say to tell people is, well, it's between Russia and China and Afghanistan and India, sort of sandwiched in between. But the problem with that, I think, is that you're defining Central Asia in terms of other countries.
Oh, I see.
And I think Central Asia has its own identity and its own importance, regardless of the fact that it borders on Russia, it borders on China, and so on. But to explain to people why it's important, you do have to start with the location.
I see.
Yeah.
You know what? I was on the home hospitality in New Hampshire, and there was this very interesting situation when they brought hummus, and they say that's your national dish. Please enjoy yourself. Maybe they mistake with the hummus, or maybe they thought that as the Middle East.
Yeah, they probably mistook it with Middle East,
Yeah.
Central Asia, Middle East. They must have thought.
Did you try hummus, for example?
Yes, I have.
How do you like it?
I like it. I haven't yet gotten to the point where I can drink a lot of it. I see sometimes when they bring hummus out at a meal, some of my Kazakh friends will just drain
Yeah.
the whole thing, and I do sips. but I actually really like it. It's a unique taste. We have nothing like it in America, I would say.
And the shubat, did you try this?
This the camel
Camel milk,
milk.
yeah.
I have tried it, and I don't like it as much, I have to say, as hummus.
Me too.
Yeah,
That's okay.
yeah, but it's also interesting taste.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have been here before, yeah?
Yes.
What was the first expectation before you coming here in 90s about Kazakhstan? What did you supposed to see when you were coming? Did you
Yeah.
remember? Can you recall?
First of all, when I first came was just after the Soviet Union had broken up. So I think my first expectation was it will look like the Soviet Union, or my image of what that should
It
be.
certainly was, yeah.
Yes, and it was. But I also, I don't think I knew very much, and I hadn't studied very much about the nomadic tradition and about some of the national customs and traditions. So I remember one of my first trips, I actually was invited to a dastarkhan and was served the sheep, the entire sheep.
Oh, I see.
And this will always stick in my mind. The person who was hosting, the aksakal, was cutting up the sheep's head and serving different parts. And
What did you get?
so I got the ear.
Yeah.
Because I was the youngest at the table at the time. This was many years ago. This was like 30 years ago, more than 30. And so I got the ear because I guess you're supposed to listen to your elders, right? That's the message. And I have to say, a sheep's ear is not my favorite part of the sheep, but I ate it because I wanted to show, proper respect. And so when I had that experience, I thought, this is not Soviet, this has nothing to do with the Soviet Union, so there's something else going on here. And it got me very interested in learning more about the culture of the region and the differences, within, between Central Asia and the Slavic parts, for example, of the Soviet Union. So it was an eye-opening experience.
Oh. Is there many places you managed to go in your, how much, 7 months of the cadence?
Yes, I have started to do some regional travel, and that's in some ways it's my favorite part of the job. I like traveling outside the capital. I mean, I like being here in Astana and as well, but traveling outside is just so interesting and different.
Cultural experience.
Cultural experience. So I've been so far. First, I went to Uskümen. That was in January. Then in March, I was in Petropavlovsk.
I see.
In April, I was in Semey. And also, while in Semey, I visited Kurchatov and the Polygon, the nuclear testing site. I won't go into the details, but there's reasons why we were very interested in that area. And the U.S. has been a partner of Kazakhstan for many years on that. And then in May, just last week, I went to Atyrau.
Atyrau. Oh,
yeah.
That's totally different from the cities you've been before, yeah?
Yeah, yes,
it's
very
Kazakh, like,
yeah,
very.
Yeah.
So what was your impressions?
Of Atyrau?
Of Atyrau.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I as you would expect, I spent a fair amount of time looking at the oil developments because, we have a major stake. American companies are part of the consortium, TCO, Tengiz Chevroil. So a lot of my visit was spent on that. But I also had a chance to meet with young people, some of the alumni of our programs, some NGO activists. I had a chance to meet the Akim. Although actually now that I think I met the deputy Akim because the Akim was ill. He was ill that day, unfortunately. And actually one thing I noticed, to your point about, you said Kazakh is a lot, there were a lot more people speaking Kazakh as the first thing that they spoke. In
Yeah.
other words, they didn't go back and forth. They just, in my meetings, they would just start speaking in Kazakh. And so I did notice that. So yeah, and it was, Atsarau has had a lot of development in the last 20 or 25 years because of all the investment, in the oil production. And so there's a lot of new buildings, but as we walked around the city, I also saw something of what the old city was like, and it was quite interesting.
Oh, I see. So, if you had some expectations of Kazakhstan, yeah, and now you can see what is wrong and what is right, what was in contrary, what Kazakh, as you experienced, do think about the United States? What is the image of the United States in Kazakh mind? Is there any insights, for example?
So the image of the United States, I think it varies a lot from person to person. I haven't yet found a common idea about the United States in everyone I've met. Some people, of course, who visited the United States, like you and many others I've met, I think have a more complete view because they've seen Americans in their own cities, in their own homes, and I think one of the things that they have realized is that Americans are normal people, who have families and who care about their kids and about education,
and bills to pay,
and who have bills to pay, hardworking, all those things, and in that sense they have a lot in common with Kazakhs. But of course, there are lots of people. Most people have not visited the United States and have not had that kind of experience. And for them, I think their image is shaped either by popular culture. They have seen American musicians or athletes,
movies.
and movies, exactly. Heard American music, watched American movies, and so they may have a certain image that maybe everybody lives like a hip hop artist or something like that. I don't know.
That would be beautiful.
I'm just speculating.
Maybe in Detroit.
Yeah, it may be in Detroit, but which of course is not a very accurate picture of our country as a whole. I imagine that there are some Kazakhs too, but to be honest, I haven't met too many of them yet, whose image is shaped by some of the disinformation that's out there and the propaganda that we get, especially coming from Moscow, about what's happening in the United States, and they might think that the U.S., their image would be it's a place that there's chaos and violence and all sorts of terrible things happening, crime, etc., and that defines America. Obviously, we have problems. We do have issues and challenges that we face every day, and Americans face. But I think it's very sad that the image that comes across from some of this disinformation is very distorted. It doesn't reflect America. And I wish more Kazakhs could go visit and see what it really is like.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
But you know what? I have many friends or the people I know that says that America is, what they know is things about the social injustice, like racial segregation, etc., etc. That's an old myth from the Soviet time also. Capitalism in very harsh sort of way, LGBT, etc., etc. But then I realized that most of them are trained for the green card.
Right.
So that is really interesting. On the other hand, they have they want to live in the United States also. So it's not just like they hate it or have some information. They do understand.
Right.
And maybe the risk they have to take with this kind of
yeah.
But as you said, the pop culture, the American soft power, as we say, because when you are in America and you telling them about the Office series, The Soprano, etc., music, not even the music, the people who has some podcasts in United States, and they ask, how do you know it? How do you know it? Man, all the pop culture from America is known in the world. Americans do not understand how big this impact is. Everybody knows about it,
Yeah, yeah.
and that is kind of soft power, as I understand.
Yeah, I think it is, but it's a soft power that works in different ways. So, when we talk about power, countries projecting power, there should be some purpose to it, right? It shouldn't just be power for its own sake. I think from the American point of view, certainly from the American government, but I think our people as well, we recognize that the way we project ourselves into the world will help us at home to be safer and more prosperous. That we trade with the world, our companies invest and export. We also buy from the world. We actually buy a lot more than we sell because we usually have a trade deficit, but also having more friends in the world, having countries that feel positive about working with America, about partnering with America, is good for our own security. So there's a reason for it, for that power, right? That there's a purpose to it, we recognize that the soft power aspect, our culture, our music, our literature, our movies, the attractiveness of that is something that makes it more likely that countries will want to be our friends, that countries will want to be our allies, that they'll want to partner with us or trade with us, right? And so from that standpoint, the soft power is very, very powerful. Sometimes, going back to what I was saying earlier, the soft power can be a little bit misleading in that if people have a certain image, shaped by the particular American movie they've seen,
Yeah.
or the style of music or whatever it is, their image of the U.S. is that that's all our country is about. We're just about that one, rap star or whatever, and that's probably not necessarily the way we want to present America to the world, because we're about more than that. But on balance, I think our soft power is very important for us, and I also think it's brought a lot of gifts to the world, because there's the thing that makes that American culture so attractive to so many people, I think, is that there's an energy behind it. There's a freedom and energy, freedom of expression, freedom to be creative, and freedom to innovate, right? And that also accounts for why economically we've been so successful over the years, because our system produces a lot of innovation, new inventions, new technologies, new ideas. And people, I think, respond to that. They find it attractive. So it has its downsides sometimes, what you were saying about, the degree of freedom that we have in our country sometimes creates challenges to us, and we have issues related to free speech, we have issues related to guns in our country.
I see.
And those are all areas where striking the right balance between freedom and responsibility and limits on freedom is sometimes difficult. But Americans almost always will make the choice for more freedom, and that, I think, is a secret ingredient to some of our cultural success.
Oh, I see. Yeah, America is huge. There are really many different places with different people, different races, different ethnicity, different morality, different religions. How many is the population? The 3
It's 330 million, approximately 340 million.
It's a whole continent.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
Thanks
Well,
to
we share the
Kenya.
continent with our Canadian friends and our
the
Mexican friends. Yeah. Yeah.
So it cannot be just on one way. It's very divided. But there is the things that unite American people. That there were united American people. Maybe today they have more challenges about these uniting things. So one of them is the American dream, and American dream is the thing that you could try to sell to the world. Yeah, when you talking about the pop culture, everybody in the world knows the expression of American dream. Well, it means really different things to different individuals, but still there's the whole idea of good wealth or of many things. So what do you see when I say, what do you understand when I say the American dream? What is it?
So yeah, that's a really good question, and you're absolutely right that that it means different things to different people, even in America, right? I grew up believing, probably from my parents, that the American dream was the ability to live freely without the government telling you what to do all the time, or anyone else really in society, to live freely, to make your own choices, to have choices, and to advance in your career, in your family life, as far as your talents could take you. So, in other words, the American dream is that talent and knowledge and hard work will be rewarded.
Oh, I see.
So that you can do better than your parents did. Economically speaking, and in career advancement. So, for example, I mean, just to take my family, my father and my mother were the first ones in their families to go to college. So their parents didn't go to university. And that was a big deal. This was this was in the 1930s and 40s, actually 1940s. And then both of them, their parents had been shopkeepers, like store owners. They both went to university, and my mother became a teacher and my father became a chemist. So that idea that, you could do better than your parents did and have choice and have the ability to pursue that is the essence of the American dream, I think.
Oh, when I hear American dream, I can recall the Malcolm X speech when he says, we have never seen the American dream. The one we experienced was American nightmare. Okay, it was the 50s and 60s. There was the problems with segregation and the racial struggles. But now, do you think that it has been changed a lot from that time? I mean, the American nightmare for some of them.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say on that is that, we talk about democracy. We have a democracy, but we always have recognized, and I think maybe more today than ever, that our democracy is a journey, not a destination. In other words, it's an ongoing evolution, and we're always going to be working on it. And frankly, I think that's true of any democracy anywhere in the world. So that journey, that not the destination, but the journey, is something America's been taking. We've been taking this trip for 250 years now. And I also want to mention that, a lot of times other countries look at us and they say, well, why are you talking to us about human rights when you have your own problems at home? And as you know, the United States talks a lot about human rights. It's part of our foreign policy. We have this annual human rights report that the State Department produces every year, where every country in the world, has a chapter, and we talk about all the problems and the issues. So I totally get it. I understand when someone looks at that and says, you shouldn't lecture to us about human rights when you've got all these problems at home. And my response to that, and I think our government's response, is to say, we know we have problems. We own them. We admit them, and we have to constantly work on them. But exactly for that reason, we can help you. We can work with you as partners for your own democratic journey, right? Your own evolution of democracy. Because we've learned some lessons. We haven't always followed what we learned, and we're still working on that. But we've learned a lot from our own history, our history of injustice, our history of conflict between groups. And so we can share that experience with you, and maybe your journey will be better than ours then. It'll be smoother because you will avoid some of our mistakes.
I heard the quote. It was really funny for me. It was just this way. America has only two processes in the history. One is to create the formula that people are equal by the creator and endowed with the unalienable rights,
Right.
such as freedom, or not freedom,
Life,
liberty,
liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
yeah,
And the second process was to define who are the people are. Who are the people? So first it was the white Protestant man, then only man, white man, then white and black man, then white, black and woman also.
yeah.
And now it's more and more and more. So do
Yeah.
you do you agree with this phrase?
I do. I like that way of looking at it. That's exactly right. Yeah, the basic concept, the principle was laid out in our founding documents, in our Declaration of Independence, and also our Constitution. But realizing those principles for everyone has taken 200 years, 250 years, and it's still going on.
I was in one lesson of American federalism, and it was about the Constitution. So I have the little book right now, and it was saying that American Constitution has only 4,000 and half words, such as little essay that students are writing every day, and the whole power of these 4,000 and half words is about the idea that it brings, not the words, but the context. So you can adjust it, use it how you just in the situation. You can understand the laws by this way or other way. It depends on the context, on the history age, etc., etc.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very true. By the way, when you were asking me earlier about the American dream, it made me think. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, you're welcome.
So what do you think is the Kazakh dream? Like, how would you define that for your country? What is the Kazakh dream?
Kazakh dream. Well, that would be interesting. As I can define it, Kazakh dream. First, just for me, because it could be different from people, from man to man. For me, is united country. By united, I mean united by thoughts, united by mentality, united by goals and values. Because as I can see, my own country right now, it is divided in many bubbles and many Kazakhstans, which cannot, not likely connect with each other. So that is the first one. The second one, I want every Kazakh to be rich. Yeah, that is very simple and even primitive.
Right.
But that is what people usually want. There is the saying, the Kazakh'ın toyu bitmesin. The Kazakh celebrations, the Kazakh weddings should not be stopped. It should be continuing. And that is a kind of the wishes we have about the Kazakhs. So we experienced the big tragedy in the beginning of the century. So we lost a lot of people, and we lost many things, such as the ideas that was the nomadic culture before, and that is still the problem. It's still a trauma for us.
Right.
So I wish my people, my Kazakhs, to overgrow it, to make it just the word in the history book, but not the tragedy as we have it now.
Yeah.
So that is the point for me.
I see. Oh, that's very. I like that. I like the way you expressed it. Is that when you were talking about the tragedies? This is like was it Asharshaluk?
Yeah, the famine.
The famine. Because before I came here, I read a book called The Hungry Steppe by Sarah Cameron, and which was very enlightening for me, because I knew a little bit I certainly knew about Soviet history and Stalinist period and the repressions and purges of Stalin, but I had never read the details about the famine here in Kazakhstan, and I was horrified, especially because the impact was, on a per capita basis, was actually worse than even in Ukraine. And I was really shocked. And also, when you think back on the way that was carried out and the whole goal behind it, the thought that you could take nomads and turn them in 1 year, make them into collective farmers, is just so idiotic. I can't.
It's monstrous. Yeah.
Yeah, it's monstrous. And anyway, but that, yeah. And I saw by the way, in Atyrau, there's a very moving monument to the Ashar-Shaluk. I know there's one in Astana and Almaty as well, but I saw the one in Atyrau last week.
The situation is getting better from year to year. They put in the monuments, they releasing the books, and in public speech there are more and more about this. I think it is going just good, but we can still do better.
Yeah,
it depends. Also, we have to admit it as the tragedy. I mean, on the national level, but okay, it is not of my competence. You have mentioned the events that are sponsored by the embassy. You have a lot of them, yeah?
We do.
Can we name several of them? The most popular, or maybe someone wants to go.
Yeah. So, we have that we've sponsored for 6 years now is Kazakh Forum.
Kazakh Forum, okay.
Which I think you may know about, which is about working with media, journalists, social media influencers, and others who want to develop Kazakh language content in media and looking at latest technologies and so on. I had a chance to attend that several weeks ago, but I think that's a very popular and exciting thing that we do all the time. We also have exchange programs that we sponsor where we sponsor trips to the United States to learn about a particular issue, or sometimes for students to study for a year. We have a high school exchange program called FLEX, Future Leaders Exchange Program, which gives an opportunity for a young person from Kazakhstan. It's not only for Kazakhstan, it's a much bigger project, but I think we're sending maybe about 100 high school students each year to live with an American family and go to high school in America. We have university exchanges, we have teacher exchanges, and then a lot of things with professions, lawyers and scientists and business people getting chances to visit America. So we do, we have quite a few things. We also, I should mention, since we're doing a podcast here, and this is about media, that we have a number of projects that are focused on working with journalism, media, giving opportunities for people to do reporting. We even have a program where journalists can go to the United States and do stories, like do reporting from the U.S. and it's facilitated by one of our programs. So there's an awful lot. All the information is on our embassy website and and our social media pages. So I encourage people to look into the possibilities.
Speaking of similarities between United States and Kazakhstan, I know that would be few of them, but not so much. But could you name some? Maybe you have noticed the similarities between our two countries.
Yeah. So first of all, just at the human level, and this goes back to something I was saying earlier too. I feel that there's a lot. We have a lot in common in terms of what people want for their children and for their families. Obviously they want to put food on the table and have a stable income, and that's common between our countries. But they also want something better for their children. They want education. They want to see their children succeed. But that's probably not just true of Kazakhstan and America. That's maybe more universal. But I've seen that common feeling in the people I've met here. I also think it's interesting to look at some of the similarities in the artistic style especially between our Native Americans in the United States and the Kazakh people, because and of course I know there's speculation about whether there was a migration from the Altai across Siberia and the land bridge, and maybe it's from the same genetic pool, you might say. The people are similar, and there's some similarities even in appearance. But I also notice when I look at art here, especially traditional art styles, and the tuzkis that you see hanging in the yurt, that it reminds me so much of Native American styles in art that I've seen too, and And in fact, I hope soon to have some art coming from the U.S. because ambassadors in our system are allowed to have their own small art exhibit. So in my home, we'll have some American artwork displayed, and I purposely asked to have Native American artwork so that you could see that similarity. And I guess the other thing I would mention is that the value that we put on being sovereign and independent and being able to make your own choices is very similar. Americans feel passionately about wanting to, not have somebody else tell us what to do, especially from outside, right? And I sense that in Kazakhstan as well, that there's this feeling that we are our own country, our own nation, and we should be able to make our own choices. And I know it's maybe harder for Kazakhstan because of where it's located and its neighborhood, but I see that as a common desire in Americans and Kazakhs.
As you notice the similarities between us and the Native Americans, there is the interesting thing. You have the Native American History Culture Museum in Washington,
yes,
D.C. Yeah.
Yes.
And when I was passing by, our guide was saying that there is no corners there because Native Americans, they believe that you have the bad spirits in the corners.
Oh.
In our traditional homes, the yurta, we don't have corners too either. Mm-hmm. So
yeah,
maybe that was one of the similarity.
Yeah.
Did you happen to listen to modern Kazakh music, for example?
I've heard some. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've heard a few examples of that, but I'm far from being an expert. You can educate me on who I should listen to.
What kind of music do you like?
That's a complicated question because I like a lot of different kinds of music. I've had different musical influences on me over my life. When I was a child, my parents were an influence, and they brought classical music into the home, and I listened to Bach and Mozart and all the Vivaldi and all this great classical music. But my parents were very much into blues and jazz. So we had a lot of that in the home that I listened to as a child as well. And then when I was a little older, I have 3 older sisters, and they were bringing music into the house. And so through them, I started listening to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all the rock music of the 60s and 70s. And also there were, I don't know, these names may be less familiar, but James Taylor, Carole King, Joni Mitchell. So these are like sort of what we would call folk rock or folk music. And my sisters kind of introduced me to that. And when I got a little older, I had a friend who was a few years older than me who was kind of my musical advisor, and he would tell me who to listen to and show me new people. And then I got into David Bowie.
Oh, okay.
And Elvis Costello. I don't know if you know who that is. He's British as well.
British invasion, yeah.
Yeah, the second British invasion. And Neil Young and some, so this was what I was listening to a little bit later. And then since then, probably my biggest musical influence has been iTunes and then Spotify, because you can discover a lot, especially Spotify, because again, I feel like I'm doing a commercial I shouldn't do advertisement for Spotify, but any streaming service has that feature where you put in one artist and then it leads you to all these other ones and you discover new ones. And so in the last few years, I've been learning and discovering all kinds of music. But I would say, I tend to listen to a lot of rock music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a little bit of hip hop, jazz, especially older jazz from the 1950s and 60s. And I just know what I like. So when I hear something, it appeals to me. I even had, my son, who and my daughter both are very into music, and they send me things to listen to. And just to give you an example of how unusual it can be sometimes. My son sent me some months ago a Spotify clip from something. It was called Music from Saharan Cell Phones.
Oh.
So this is like the Sahara, North Africa,
Desert.
the desert area, and there's this incredible music with great rhythm that's being made there. And I think it's called cell phones because people listen to it on their cell phones. That's how they're hearing the music. And so I never would have found this on my own, but fortunately I had somebody recommending it, and now I listen to it all the time. So anyway, so that was a complicated answer to your
No,
simple
it's okay.
question. Yeah.
But what I want to say that Kazakh music is developing really rapidly. That like last 5 years or maybe 10.
Mm-hmm.
And now what I noticed, we were in America with the group of Central Asians, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and everybody knows the Kazakh music. And that's interesting. That's kind of soft power of Kazakhnas and Kazakh culture in the region. Because there are many things that should unite the region. And one of them is the culture and even the pop culture, which is really really related to the youth, to the young people that want to hear really modern music, such as jazz. You say we have Kazakh jazz and Kazakh blues also. We're trying to make some kind of this, and Kazakh indie. The people like, I don't know, that does it ring the bell? But there is the Moldanazar or Orhan Khan. There was the Darkhan Juz before. Many interesting singers we have here.
Yeah.
And so I can make you a list.
Yeah,
by the way.
make me a playlist, and I would love to start to explore some of the modern Kazakh music. And just a question for you on that: is there any influence in modern Kazakh music coming from more traditional styles, or is it something new, something completely different?
That is the mix. That is the mix for sure. There is the many impact of American hip hop culture in our hip hop. It's really interesting because what we have the new wave of Kazakh music, and you can see that the heritage they have is not Russian by the Russian rap, but it is from directly from America. So there's the Detroit, the hip hop. We had the Eminem, the West Coast, East Coast, all this stuff. So that is the one point they have. The whole beauty of globalization and the modern time is that you can get information and get the content directly from the place it was created. And the second one, we are still trying. There's the colonization motives, and we are trying to find our own sounding. Many like traditional instruments they use, and they mix the modern instruments and traditional, the new approach, like the old traditional things like kui, and the new approach like the bass guitar, and that is really interesting that they have. So also the vocal is improving all the time. So what I'm really proud of the Kazakh music just right now. That
sounds like there's a lot to be proud of, and there's a lot of experimentation going on, right? Mixing styles, which is really important, because what ultimately the best music is the result of a blending of different influences and styles to create something new and better, or maybe not better, but more interesting, right? And because I think even I'm now listening to another podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts called "The History of Rock and Roll in 500 Songs." So the person who did the podcast has actually picked 500 songs, and he's using that as a way of illustrating the history. And one of the first things you realize in listening to the first 20 songs is that rock and roll itself emerged from so many different influences. You had country western music, you had boogie woogie, what was called boogie woogie, you had blues, you had something rhythm and blues, and they all came together to create something that just took over, the popular music scene in America and much of the world. But it only happened because these different styles came together. So it's
talking about mixes, and there was a saying that America was the melting pot before. Now it's kind of salad bowl.
Salad bowl. Some people use that expression. I think that the evolution from melting pot to salad bowl was a result of realizing that if you tried to enforce a certain American standard on everyone that people were losing their sense of identity, because the identity of somebody comes from their parents and their grandparents and their family history, as well as what they're experiencing today in their life. And you can't just erase the past and start over new. I mean, you can try, but that's what Stalin tried to do, right, with the collectivization, and you see the result of it. So I'm not saying that melting pot was a form of collectivization, but the point was that in the old days there was this idea in America that everyone had to conform to a certain way of speaking English, to a certain set of traditions and customs, and everything they brought with them was worthless, right?
Yeah.
It should just be thrown away. And the salad bowl idea is that everyone brings their unique backgrounds and traditions and knowledge, and it comes together in this big bowl, and you toss it around a little bit, and you can still see the individual pieces, but it tastes really good together when you mix it together. So that's the idea there. But I do think it's important to recognize that America is a country that's the product of people moving in from somewhere else. Obviously, Native Americans are the exception to that, and there's a whole story of the way they were treated over centuries that's horrible, and there's lots of things that we Americans feel bad about and try to make better, but we can't change now what happened then. But so that's part of the American story too. But much of America today is all made up of all these immigrant groups who came over centuries, and one important value that we try to preserve as a country, and again, I'm not sure that every American agrees with this, but I think the majority do, is that our strength as a country is from that diversity, that diversity equals strength, especially when you can get the salad bowl going and mix it together in a good way. So that's very important to us, and it's something when we engage with the rest of the world and we have dialogues with governments or civil society around the world, we talk about our own experience as a country of immigrants, as a country of diversity, and we hope other countries will find the way to benefit from diversity too.
Yeah, the time has changed. Yeah, it was like, I remember there was the Ministry of Observation, I think, in Israel. It was about the people who were coming, the Aliyah, so-called the waves, from the Soviet Union, etc., and from Arab countries before. So they would need to incorporate in Israeli society. Mm-hmm. But now, like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it has changed. It was Minister of Integration. Because integration is the current word, and it is more accurate. It's not about erasing all the heritage you have had before and become the citizen of new country. It's about including you, but also saving your own identity as the of your ancestors, for example. Yeah. And also when we tell them about the mixes and the immigrants, the American cuisine itself.
Yes.
When they say that Americans, that's also about the stamps. Today I want to be the myth breaker, myth buster. So one of the myths that Americans don't have any cuisine, maybe on apple pie or only, but many things that we think that there's not American, but it's American as it is. For example, the New York style pizza is more American than Italian, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Chili con carne is more American than Mexican. Even. It's Texas dish.
Yeah. Actually, our food is a great example of how the salad bowl concept works, because our food is really just a blending of lots of different international cuisines. I guess there's a handful of things that maybe people think of as distinctively American, although their origin is probably somewhere else, like the hamburger, cheeseburger, hot dog, apple pie, as you said. But although I imagine the apple pies were made in Kazakhstan before they were made in America, since the apple comes from Kazakhstan, right? But what we've seen, as you pointed out, is that the cuisines of other countries come to America and then get twisted a little bit or changed in
Yeah.
small ways to make them more delicious for Americans who they like it more, and then that food gets exported to the rest of the world as something distinctively American. So that's true all across the board. And I feel lucky to when I'm in America to have so many choices of
Yeah.
the kinds of food I can eat, and that's that's a blessing. For me anyway, I like it.
Today I hear many things about rewriting history, yeah, or overwriting history, with Southern generals, for example. Yeah, the generals there were fought for the Confederation.
Yes,
and
yes.
There is one case really interesting. Everybody knows Henry Ford. He was a genius, by the way. Yeah, and when I was a child, I knew him. I knew about him, and
Right,
he was
right.
Invented the conveyor, the Rouge plant, etc., the big industry. But coming to USA, the only thing I heard about him that he was the big-time anti-Semitic guy, and someone said that maybe he was the second after Hitler who was anti-Semitic in that kind of level, because he didn't just believe in the conspiracy theory. He has created some of them. Maybe not him, but with his money and his
Yeah.
abilities.
Yeah.
But now it's really interesting about the history. And it's really, I'm really curious how Americans manage with that kind of controversial things in the history, such as, for example, Confederation.
Yeah.
Some of them say, the Southern guys, they say, I respect my heritage, but I don't respect the hate that it was presented before.
Yeah.
And that is a good formula for it, I think.
Yeah. So you're raising some really important questions that we, get discussed a lot in the United States and are controversial sometimes, difficult to manage, I suppose. I think that the starting point has to be that you acknowledge your history, that you talk about it, that you allow books to be published about it, and to reveal the good and the bad, and the ugly, as we would say. And only by doing that can you learn something from that history and try to do better in the future. So I'm a big believer. I studied history in university. That was my major subject. And I've always loved to read history books since I was a child, but even till today. So I think a lot about these issues. So it's very important to come to terms with our own history. The Confederacy in the Civil War was, fighting a war to split the United States, to make it into two countries, and according to our president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, and most people since, what they were doing was illegal and against the Constitution. But more importantly, or just as important, they were, the cause that they were fighting for, the reason that they wanted to be separate was to protect the institution of slavery. And I think obviously today everyone agrees, but it wasn't agreed in 1860s, back 250 years ago, 150 years ago, that slavery was an evil thing that needed to be ended, needed to be stopped to enslave other people. So it's really hard to separate that history of slavery and the reasons why the Confederacy fought a war and existed. It's hard to, you can't separate those two things. And so I completely understand why many people in America now, and I think this is supported by our federal government and by President Biden too, want to change the names of things that are named after Confederate leaders, that want to stop showing the Confederate flag. And while I do understand why there are people who in the South primarily who feel that there's something about their own heritage that needs to be preserved and remembered, I think there are ways of doing that without having these symbols of, the name, a military base named for a Confederate general, or flying the Confederate flag over the state capitol, which used to be the case in many southern states. So that's, I personally support the changes that have been made on that. But I think what's most important is not just to change the flags or get rid of certain names, but to really study the history and understand what happened and the facts of what happened, and to use it as a lesson to avoid these things in the future. So anyways, yeah, history is a subject that I think should be studied more. A lot of times when I visit schools, even here in Kazakhstan, and talk to young people, they ask me for my advice. Sometimes they even say, if we want to be an ambassador someday, what should we do? And one of the pieces of advice I give them is study history.
I do agree, absolutely. If the one who doesn't know the history will most probably repeat it once and once again.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of things in history that I don't want to be repeated anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
No, never again, as they say. Yeah, in
Right,
Holocaust, for
right.
example.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I think another quote from a famous person, the American writer Mark Twain, one of our famous writers.
Everybody knows him.
Everyone knows Mark Twain. He supposedly said, sometimes quotes get assigned to somebody and they didn't really say it, but he supposedly once said that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
You've heard this expression. And we see the rhyming happen over and over again, unfortunately, even in our day.
Tell me about rhymes. As I know, your master's degree is the Soviet studies.
Mm-hmm.
That way, in that age, it was Soviet studies. Now it's post-Soviet studies.
Right.
Fortunately.
Yes.
Yeah. And the heritage of the Cold War is still can be. You can still feel the heritage of the whole Cold War. It didn't disappear. It's still with us.
Mm-hmm.
And after the Cold War, there was a very interesting moment, as I understand. I was really little that way. I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I cannot recall, but what I can read or can see in the movies, there was the moment then the liberty and freedom has prevailed, yeah? And also the Fukuyama releases his writing, the end of the history,
yes.
And the liberalism will prevail, it will dominate, etc., etc. But in 30 years that has passed, we can definitely see that this model doesn't work. Mm-hmm. The history never ends, and the democracy and liberty, liberation, of freedom, they are not particularly can be imposed, for example, or included in some systems. Everybody, the diversity is not even in the United States. Diversity is the global one, and sometimes we have to celebrate the differences between us also. Yeah, but and the democracy that was imposed, some kind of didn't work. For example, in Afghanistan or Iraq, and it was also supported by the military presence, which didn't help, as we can see. So the soft power is the one that works, as I know just right now, and it is the thing that America can offer to the world. But going back to the Cold War, so you were living in the time. You remember many things.
That's how old I am. Yeah.
You remember the Reagan speeches, for example, after the Cold War. How did you feel? What was the moment when Soviet Union collapsed, for example? Yeah. What, especially when you were studying it, so you were differently understands what is going on. So what was your feeling about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communistic bloc?
When the Soviet Union broke up and became a set of independent states, I thought it was a great development for human history. I thought it would lead to more freedom, more national identity, where people could identify with their own roots and their own histories more freely. and that it would lead to a world that would be more peaceful and more stable than it was during the Cold War. And at that time, in the early 1990s, one of the interesting aspects was I was a graduate student in 1989, 1990, and things were changing so fast and so unexpectedly. People were not expecting the change, that it was a great equalizer if you were a student, because the professors didn't know what was going to happen next, right? And the books that they used to use and the research was being proven to be wrong or just completely different. And so it was very much the students and the professors were at the same level. We were all watching what was happening together and being surprised every day. But I also remember that time as being one of great hope for a lot of people, thinking like this is a great breakthrough.
Wind of change, yeah? By Scorpions.
Winds of change, yeah. And I think that Francis Fukuyama got a little carried away with his hope and euphoria. And this idea about the end of history is very flawed. It's just wrong. And I think now even Fukuyama, I think he's still alive. Yeah. He would acknowledge that.
He has.
Yeah, and he has. But the idea that human history could ever just stop and we reach some point where, it's inevitable that capitalism and democracy and so on, liberal democracy is going to be everywhere and all at once. The idea that it's inevitable, that it will definitely happen no matter what, is very flawed, because to me it reminds me a little bit of communism, yeah. Right? Because the ideology of communism is that there are these laws of history that you can't change. No matter what you do, there's going to be feudalism and then capitalism, yeah. And then socialism and then communism, because that's just the law. And whatever we do is
historical materialism, they call it.
Yes, exactly, historical materialism. And that, in a way, this idea of liberal democracy triumphing is the same thing. Like, it's just going to happen. It's inevitable. And so that's obviously been wrong. It hasn't worked that way.
Do you think that the heritage of the Cold War and the things that Russia and America has between each other is... Because there was many periods, yeah? There was the periods of friendship. There was the reload. There was the thing that Russia wanted to join NATO also, and now it's really unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
You cannot even understand how. But there was the periods of really interesting integration and friendship between two countries. Mm-hmm. Will it happen before, or will it happen once again? How do you think?
When I came to the State Department, I started in 1997. My first project, the first thing I worked on, was a joint U.S.-Russian project that we called the Regional Investment Initiative. And the idea was to encourage investment coming into the regions of Russia and we had some of activities in the Far East, in Khabarovsk and Sakhalin. We were in Samara, Tomsk, Novgorod, various parts of Russia. And at that time, the United States had about $200 million a year of assistance to Russia. And these were programs that we were doing together with Russians. It wasn't something that was being imposed. It was based on requests and needs that were identified in Russia. So that was a very different period of the relationship, and it was a period of partnership. And I would very much love to return to that time. But before that can happen, some things need to change. Fundamentally, Russia needs to observe international law. It needs to not invade its neighbors and not try to take territory that belongs to its neighbors. And if that basic change can occur, then anything is possible. Because the fact is, we have a lot of common interests, right? We know this. I mean, one of our main common interests, which hopefully we can at least maintain some dialogue about, is the nuclear issue, yeah. Right? We both have these big nuclear arsenals. It needs to be regulated, controlled, and so on. But broader global issues like climate change or transnational crime, terrorism, these are things that we've cooperated with Russia on in the past, and we would like to do it in the future. But it's very hard at the moment.
I see. Yeah. You have mentioned your Jewish heritage. Your Jewish ancestors came from Russian Empire, I think. Yeah.
Yes, well, on my mother's side.
Oh.
So my mother's side
So
came
Ashkenazi.
from Ashkenazi. My mother's side came from near Vilnius. It was called Vilno.
Yeah.
And they came from a
Lithuania.
small village in what's now Lithuania, but at the time it was the Russian Empire. My father's family came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire because they emigrated from a small village called Sobrance, which is it's today Slovakia.
Oh.
So it's the eastern part of Slovakia, not too far from the border with Ukraine, and so that's where my family came from. But I actually had a chance many years ago to go to the village where my father's family came from, and it was fascinating. I was looking for any remains of the Jewish community that was there, and the only thing we found was a cemetery. And the cemetery was outside the town, like on the outskirts, and it had been forgotten about. No one, it was neglected. And so all the gravestones were surrounded by trees and plants. It was like you walked into the forest and all of a sudden there's a graveyard there. And it was the most amazing thing. So some of my ancestors were probably buried there.
Oh, I see. So you celebrating the cultural experience of your ancestors also.
Yes,
You mentioned you speak Russian also, yeah? You studied Russian.
I did, yeah.
Do you speak Yiddish or אתה מדבר עברית?
לא.
לא.
לא, אני לא מדבר עברית. That's very impressive. No, when I was a kid, we did study Hebrew at Hebrew school. Like once a week, we would go to the synagogue and study Hebrew. But I didn't really learn enough and I've forgotten most of what I knew. I know words. I know Hebrew words, and I can read prayers in Hebrew from the prayer book. But I can't really speak the language. My wife speaks Hebrew better than me, so she.
Do you visit the synagogue here in Astana?
I have, yes, I have. I was there at Hanukkah, the time of Hanukkah, and I see the rabbi Rav Shmuel, who's the head of the synagogue, often. I mean, it's a very impressive building. I have to say, it's beautiful.
So the Judaism is the part of your culture. It means very, very important for you also.
Yes.
As the cultural heritage of your people.
It is. It's important to me. I was raised in a family that really valued Jewish traditions, celebrated all the holidays, and studied Jewish history. Again, going back to history, my father would teach me things. He would read books with me. It was very much a part of my upbringing. But I have to say that, one of the great opportunities I've had here in Central Asia, first in Uzbekistan, now here, is to learn more about other religions and to visit houses of worship. I've been to many mosques in the last 4 years in this region and had a chance to talk to imams and so on. And also to Orthodox Church. I've been to the Orthodox and the Lutheran Church here in Astana. Yeah. And one of the things I enjoy about this region is that there is this kind of blend of and tolerance, I would say, for religion, which is very good to see.
Yeah, and the tolerance is the great way to celebrate the differences in Kazakhstan. And let the peace be upon us and all religions and all ethnicities. And our Kazakhstan will grow stronger and be a much better place to live for our kids also. Mm-hmm. I thank you for the conversation we had. That was the pleasure for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was for me too.